welcome back to Neon Liberalism. I'm Samantha Lee here with my co-host Jason Brigham, and our returning guest, Adam Gurri, editor-in-chief of our parent publication, Liberal Currents. And today we are going to talk about civil rights, or more precisely, the civil rights movement, which seems increasingly relevant in the age we live in. Personally, it's something that I've become more and more interested in because I've lived through a number of protest events, to put it in broad terms, right? Whether these were the initial Black Lives Matter protests after Ferguson or the George Floyd protests. The George Floyd protests put somewhere between 15 and 25, it's hard to count exactly, million Americans into the street over a period of months and did not, I'm going to say, really succeed in changing police policy to the extent that they aspired to. On the other end of the scale, we've had the Women's March, again, put millions of people into the streets. A few years later, Roe versus Wade gets overturned. Elsewhere in the world, climate activists throw soup at paintings and glue themselves to walls. And I've likewise been unable to really, it seems anyways, that group has been unable to make the kind of policy progress that they wanted to. The civil rights movement, on the other hand, achieved some real stark policy successes, really changed American society, not as much as they might have hoped, but they changed it. And so I've been really driven to try and look back and figure out how they did it, and if there are lessons to be learned from what they did that we can apply to the world we live in.
Yeah, absolutely. At the risk of dating myself, Samantha, a protest movement that I recall is opposing the Iraq War in 2003, 2004, and we can add that to the pile of failed movements, right? So, but the civil rights movement, like you said, beyond the legal changes, or maybe because of the legal changes, I would say that the changes in American society were tremendous and long lasting, and of course we're in an era of reaction and pushback from slim majorities in presidential elections because of the celebrity of now two men, not just one. But I think a lot of those changes are surely enduring.
No, I think that's exactly right. Occasionally I'll get people pushing back on me saying, well, they're rolling back the progress of the civil rights movement. The Roberts Court has really hollowed out the Voting Rights Act. And, the Trump administration appears to be trying to resegregate the federal workforce in a lot of ways. So that's all happening. But I think from our perspective, it's receding into the mists of history now, so it can be hard to remember what a waking nightmare Jim Crow was. We actually have Toby Buckle published today at Liberal Currents, and he talks a little bit about what lynchings used to be like. That these weren't, some of them were just murders done in the night, but many of them were
Spectacles.
public ceremonies,
Yeah.
right? Where somebody would be taken by a crowd, tortured while they were alive, burned to death, that bits and pieces of their body or their clothing would be kept as relics, and that this was all public, right? This was all done in public, and it created a regime of absolutely pervasive terror in every aspect of life.
There's a reason that the icon of the lynching is the image of a man hanging from a tree. Like they did it out in the open. They didn't kill someone. This wasn't desaparecidos, like the terror of the regime is they make critics disappear in the night and you never hear from them again. You kind of assume you know the reason why, but it's never said by anyone. That's a different kind of terror. The Jim Crow terror was a public terror. It was out in the open. The powers of society openly, this isn't like you can just expose this and it'll stop. They're exposing it. They're practically bragging about it.
No, I think it's one of the things I was struck by in this book that we've all read. Thomas Ritz is Waging a Good War, which is about the civil rights movement. And he talks about Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was not just some random woman who got tired one day. Rosa Parks was a member of the NAACP. She attended the Highlander Folk School, which is kind of a training ground for people who wanted to change society. And she talks about her experience at the Highlander Folk School. And that one of the things that really mattered to her was that this was a place where white people and black people lived together and learned together and made food together and ate together. And she talks about how it helped her to learn to look white people in the eye and know that they weren't any better than she was, right? And that's something that we maybe take for granted in the world we live in. All right, but the Jim Crow regime of terror, it got into people, right? It created habits of public subservience that were pervasive in life. And so I think it's worth remembering a little bit about how murderous and, like I said, all permeating Jim Crow was when we talk about the civil rights movement and what they achieved in breaking the back of Jim Crow.
Yeah, I mean, you raise Rosa Parks, and it's a story we've heard a thousand times, and a story you hear a thousand times. Its ability to shock you becomes greatly diminished. It just does, right? But thinking about the publicness of Jim Crow, what could be more public than you're on a city bus and somebody literally demands you give up your seat? I mean, you stand up, you're not good enough, get out here. That's my seat. I mean, that's just right in front of everybody,
Hmm.
in the middle of the workday,
That's right.
every day, happening to everybody, so
Yeah, a constant.
there's the lynchings, and then there's just the constant low level all the time to everybody.
Humiliation
Yeah.
and yeah,
Yeah.
control.
Yes, humiliation, control, all done publicly, all done effort, like we say, where everyone could see it on public transit everywhere. And so one of the things that I tried to emphasize in the essay that I wrote on this subject, How to Win a Rigged Game, is to understand the strategic picture that the civil rights movement was coming from, right? That they did not control any formal levers of power in the South, right? They didn't have legislatures, they didn't have governorships. In many places, they functionally did not have the right to vote, right? So that they are locked, and in many ways, they're locked out of formal power, right? The system is built so that they can never actually get into elections and acquire the levers of formal power. So, but that doesn't stop them, right? They're able to change the terrain of conflict in a way that lets them exercise power without having to go through these formal levers of power. And so one of the big ways that they try to do this is through nonviolence. I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit, Adam.
Yes. Well, it can be easy to look at the list of recent failures of activism in this country to turn it to concrete ends and be discouraged and think we've forgotten something. But I think it's also easy to forget how long the struggle against Jim Crow was until the victorious parties emerged, and how many approaches that were tried backfired enormously. So in Rick's book, he documents, there's the civil rights generation of black activists, many of whom were veterans, and this, a lot much has been made of this in the histories previously, but it's not like they were the first wave of black veterans either. There were black veterans of World War One. There were black veterans of multiple previous wars, and in each case, he documents often they went back home and said, I'm sick of dealing with this, of putting up with this. I'm not going to, I'm gonna live my life with dignity. And if they come for me, I'm gonna shoot them, and not just one of them, right? Because there were several men of that generation in a community that could be armed and trained and experienced. But the fact of the matter is they were outnumbered, and they weren't the only ones who had been veterans, and they didn't control the police and the seats of power. So even organizing private citizens who are trained in military tactics and using military hardware, often what happened is a bigger backlash where some of the absolute worst, you can't even, I mean, we call them race riots, but they were really pogroms. There were complete pogroms in towns in the South in the first half of the 20th century, where whole black communities get wiped out.
Yeah.
Um,
Famously, the Tulsa Race
Tulsa,
Massacre
yeah, is
in
the big one.
1921, I want to say,
Yeah,
yeah, has all of these features that you're talking about, where there's an attempted lynching, there's a group of armed black veterans who say we're going to put a stop to this, and like you say, they are just completely outnumbered by the white community who kills all of them and goes on a pogrom, like you said. Keeps on killing. It's hard to tell how many people they kill. Estimates vary pretty widely, but they definitely killed dozens or hundreds of people, burned down an entire black neighborhood, and everybody skates, right? Nobody is ever punished for this.
yeah, yeah. It's barely even talked about in American history, even after the Civil Rights era. So I think what happens with the Civil Rights era generation of activists, both the grown-ups and the students, is they look at the strategic situation a little more carefully. Now, some things had changed since Tulsa. I think most critically, the mass media environment was much more nationally integrated at that point than it would have been in 1921. Another thing is that the federal government was incomparably bigger and more powerful in the 1960s than it would have been in 1921. So, Jim Crow, very local and state-based. They obviously they have their representatives in the federal government, but their control of the federal government is not absolute. And you get people who are at least vocally sympathetic to fighting it in the federal government at various stages. Now, what happens is just because you are vocally supportive of it does not mean that you, as a politician, either president or congressman, are willing to stick your neck out to do what it takes to make any difference. And so, for example, one of the examples Ricks gives is of the Kennedys, who very much believed, okay, we're pro-reform, but it's going to be on our timetable and based on what is our own political calculations. And essentially, from the jump, you get the freedom rides where they're forced to react to what activists are doing. They can't just do things. They can't plan things out ahead of time. They have to respond to supposedly the people that they're politically allied with, but mostly people that they consider to be a nuisance from the get-go. And then the third aspect of this that it didn't change, but is perhaps different from our situation so far, is that they turned the great strength of Jim Crow into its weakness. So the things we were just talking about that make Jim Crow different from now, the very public nature of it, the fact that they will simply kill you if you step out of line, they turn that into a strength of the movement because especially when you combine it with mass media and a strong government, all they have to do is act completely normal and ordinary, and the enforcement arm of Jim Crow will act completely deranged in public and in front of cameras with very little provocation. So from the beginning, the whole plan is more or less just act like normal, dignified human beings and let Jim Crow do what it does and show that to national audiences to shock them and make these politicians who talk big actually take action. Those are the key ingredients.
No, I think that's all correct. And there's one thing I wanna go back to there because I said at the start that they didn't control any of the formal levers of power, and that's true in the South that they don't control government there. But a key component of the civil rights movement is Brown versus Board of Education, right? Which is a major. There's two, but there's in fact two different Brown versus Board of Educations. We don't really need to get into that legal complication here. It's a major legal battle. It's won by the NAACP in 1954, and it basically says that separate but equal is unconstitutional. All right, and this is not a mass movement, right? This is like a legal struggle kind of waged in courtrooms over many years, but in an important way, it provides a legal constitutional justification for the movement. And you see Dr. King appeals to it. The very first speech he ever gives in association with the movement, early on in the Montgomery bus boycott, he talks about Brown versus Board of Education. He talks about how we have the law and we have the Constitution on our side. Notably, however, these hadn't been enforced, right? That's a really key thing, right? Brown versus Board is passed, or not passed, but it's, been issued, but it's not being enforced in the South, right? Because functionally, like you say, Democratic politicians at the national level, they have power, but they don't want to use it, right? They're like, I don't want a confrontation. I don't want the mess. I don't want the hassle. I don't want to alienate, blah, 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 blah. And the movement understands how to take the formal levers of power that are like kind of on their side, like the federal courts, like the Democratic Party, and force them into action.
Yeah, it's one of the themes that Ricks puts forward is that there was actually a tension between the young people of the what we think of as the civil rights movement starting in the mid 50s, who are trying to, like you say, actually get Brown versus Board, like, implemented in tangible ways. And the older guard associated with the NAACP, who had waged this long legal battle that culminated in Brown, right? And he says, the younger people are sort of like, the older people want this. They're like, this is the right strategy. We're making progress. We just got to the Supreme Court and won. We're just going to keep going with this. And the younger people are sort of like, it's taking a long time. We need to move things along, and it's funny. It's a little funny because you kind of look back in hindsight and you're like, well, it's so obvious they needed both, and the idea that it would needed to be one or the other seems obviously not the case.
Rick's focuses on the ground action, right, which he should, and it makes sense. But there were some real, Brown versus Board of Education was an extremely important symbolic victory. It was important in that it provided the legal basis for later legislation that the court then supported. But I would say there were other things the court did that don't get talked about as much that probably had more concrete effects that the NAACP should absolutely get credit for. One was you keep talking about the Democratic Party. Obviously, the actual party that ran party quote unquote that ran Jim Crow was the Southern Democratic Party. But one of the biggest victories in court was the end of the white primary. There was at one time in the South primaries like we have now, but only whites were allowed to participate, which makes sense. It was the South. Now, for the disenfranchisement tools that they used in the South, they were never that blatant because that was already deemed unconstitutional to do because of the 15th Amendment. So they would disenfranchise African Americans and others, but they would use other rationales to do so, like the reading tests and things like that. But with the primaries, they said, well, parties are private organizations, and therefore they can determine how they pick their members on their own. And so, they're going to set the rules so that only whites can vote in their primaries. The Supreme Court said that's unconstitutional. That actually was the first big bump in black enfranchisement after that. It didn't get nearly as big as it got after VRA, but it was a concrete step towards some actual black constituents, both in general and having an effect on the Democratic Party in particular, which really was the only thing that mattered in the South at that point.
Yeah, so I think, I absolutely agree with what Jason said just now that, the NAACP and the movement in practice, this is mostly the Southern Christian Leadership Council and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, other organizations, but those are the big ones. But broadly speaking, you can see these as what are sometimes called inside and outside movements or components of a movement, which is a concept that's developed by ACT UP, which is an AIDS gay rights activist movement in the 90s, 80s and 90s. And their idea is that an outside movement is something that is going to be spectacular. It is going to be public. It is going to grab attention. It is going to force a change on an issue, but that's not enough, right? You also need the inside component of the movement who are going to be inside the halls of power to actually get down to brass tacks and write a really boring law or attend some really boring sessions of the subcommittee on subcommittees to argue about how AIDS treatments are funded at hospitals and like make sure that all goes correctly. And I think you can see the NAACP and the broader movement as having that same kind of symbiosis, right? That you needed people in the streets to force a change, and you also needed some very boring lawyers to create laws, policies, win victories in the courts to codify those changes, to make sure that that popular energy actually gets transformed into enduring change.
I want to talk about how rightly we say that, a big component of what the movement did is it attracted this national mass media attention, the attention of television, the creation of these shocking images, right? But again, reading the Ricks book and his interviews, or I don't know if he did the interviews, right? But like the evidence he draws on, the speaking, the words of the people involved themselves, it's really striking how much they talk about the need to force internal reflections on the parts of the racist whites, right? The ones they encountered personally. And surely that, again, is happening through the mass media at some level too, right? But it's, the nonviolent Gandhian, if that's the right adjective form, aspect of it, is to, nonviolence is not passivity, but it's confrontational. It's like, it's sort of inviting the confrontation where you may be violently attacked, but then when you are, to sort of be standing up, and not in a violent response, but in a very pointed human response. Be conscious and aware and address your attacker and try to force reflection on their part and try to meet them, and have them see your humanity. And the participants in the movement, repeatedly talk about this. And in our era and the challenges we're facing, I think if we emphasize, not if we emphasize, but when we look back to the civil rights movement, we say, oh, it was about mass media, it was about creating these shocking images. And like, I think you hear that in today's world and you're like, well, that's not going to work. Producing shocking images is not going to do much today, but I think still this idea of provoking internal reflection is probably ultimately what you need to do. And so it may not be through shocking images on mass media that we provoke internal reflection by people, but that aspect of it, I think, still is like the key. That's still got to be it, like a series of individual, like, you got to make people rethink. You got to make people reconsider.
I have two quick thoughts on that. One is it's not a shocking image, but it's to your point. There's like a famous footage of John Lewis talking to Bull Connor, I believe. John Lewis trying to go into a white church, and this was a real moment for me because I grew up learning about the civil rights movement, had this idea that nonviolence was just purely a moral stance. That's all there was to it. That differentiated the militant activism or something vague like that, right? That was it. It was just a moral distinction. But then as an adult, I watched this this scene with John Lewis talking to Bull Connor, and essentially Bull Connor just comes off as he just looks like a thug. And he was a thug, and he looks like a thug. He carries himself like a thug. And here you have this kid who is this very earnest sounding kid just saying like, well, can I go in this church? And he's like, no, you've got your own church. He's like, well, but isn't God everyone's God? And like he keeps pushing like this very Christian point of view. Bull Connor just keeps being annoyed that he's being questioned at all. And it's like, well, if I can't go in, why don't you and I pray together here on the steps? And it's like Bull Connor was not going to do that, And it suddenly occurred to me, this is a very obvious statement now, but obviously John Lewis was playing to the camera. Like this wasn't just like this is just an earnest kid saying what he thinks, Like this, it's again, it's the same thing as the bus. Like it's that having the right person do it the right way in order to make a persuasive point. The other thing I was thinking about shocking images, though, is that they still can have power. It's just you just never know which one it is. And this was true then and now. The Selma March that ended up changing the country because I believe ABC ended up broadcasting it in the middle of an airing of Judgment at Nuremberg, and it was like a huger than usual mass audience. It's like something like a quarter of the country saw the Selma March, that wasn't the first time they had been to Selma. That wasn't the first time they'd gotten their butts beat in a very public way. But that particular one at that particular moment changed the country. It just did. That was a huge thing. Similarly, we've had police violent brutality videos and pictures for, I mean, forever. But let's say since Ferguson, you know, what, 10, 15 years of a cycle of people actually paying attention to it. In the Ferguson case, I remember Radley Balco saying, I've been covering this my whole career. It's very interesting that people are now actually paying attention to it. It's very encouraging. But that was almost nothing compared to George Floyd. Um, and what happened with George Floyd was it was just a certain kind of situation. It was just so clear that the guy just stayed there and strangled him until he died for a really long time. It was just there was just no arguing against that. I mean, they argue against it now because they can argue against anything. But visually, it was just very clear to everyone who saw it, and that's why you get tens of millions turning out for it. Similarly, when you look at the Arab Spring, it's kicked off by one man in Tunisia, self-immolating. But what most people don't know is that, a month or two before that, someone else had done the same thing. He just didn't happen to do it in as public a place. It didn't go viral. Like the conditions weren't so, in some ways we're desensitized, but sometimes the right image in the right place, it's just because it's just finicky. There's a lot of things vying for our attention, and a lot of it is violent and shocking, and so we are numb. But then you get the right thing at the right time, it can still turn out millions. That
Hmm.
doesn't mean, as Samantha says, that turning out millions is converted into practical change, but it can still work as a tactic. The issue is it's very difficult to know which one is going to be the one.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is another one of these little forgotten details from history is, well, if maybe you remember it, but many people don't seem to know her name, Claudette Colvin. Rosa Parks was not the first woman to refuse to give up her seat in Montgomery. Claudette Colvin, a few months prior to Parks, refused to give up her seat to a white woman or white man, I don't know, a white person. And Colvin is different from Parks in a couple of ways. One of them, she's a single teenage mother, and in another, she kind of fights with the cops a little bit when they come to arrest her. And the local leaders make the very cold-blooded calculation, we can't support you. Like, you can't be the face of our movement because you're a single teenage mom, and that's going to confirm a lot of stereotypes about us that we don't want. Rosa Parks is, a Sunday school teacher and a woman of impeccable moral character. And she just looks the part, right? Like we've talked about, she looks dignified, she acts dignified. And that was somebody that the movement could rally around, right? So some of it is lightning in a bottle. Some of it is these are very tactical choices, like you were talking about with John Lewis. But I do want to get back to again, to what Jason was saying, is that it wasn't always just tactical, right? That the movement, like, I think it's easy to underrate if you're a secular liberal that they were Christian. They were very Christian and they meant it, right? When they talked about how you had to love the oppressor, right? You actually had to love that man and you had to be out there trying to save his soul. And like that's hard, right? That's when a man is beating you over the head with a club, when he's calling you slurs, when he's trying to exclude you from society. Like on an emotional level, that provokes an emotional response. It just does, right? And this is obvious if you look into the details of the movement at all. It is constantly provoking an emotional response from people in the movement who are angry, who want to respond to violence with violence, right? Again, the very first meetings about the Montgomery bus boycott, some people say we should kill a few white people just to show them we mean business. And the movement has to squash that down very hard, and is constantly has to be doing this every single
Yeah.
session,
Incident. Yeah.
year in, year
Yeah.
out. You have to work at it because Jim Crow wants you to get mad, right? Jim Crow wants you to hit back, right? That is
Mhm.
a tactical situation that they always know how to win, as we've talked about, and it's a narrative situation that always plays to their narrative. Look at these violent black people that we are protecting ourselves from. It might be bullshit, but it works as a story, right?
Yeah, they harass you, they poke you, they slap you, and then you punch them, and then they shoot you.
Exactly.
That's laid out very clearly at some point in the book. I forget.
Yeah, so I think that this is when we talk about nonviolence, there's a moral component, but there's also a very cold-blooded tactical component in terms of thinking, well, we tried the other thing and it like keeps on not working, so we need to change the
Yeah.
terrain here.
It is fascinating to be able to combine the two. I mean, you do see this in some movements, most famously, like well, that's sort of what Leninism was really. Like they had extreme ideological beliefs that were very, you know, that were convictions, but they were also like hyper tactical. And frankly, I was thinking as you're talking about Rosa Parks being so respectable, the funny thing is that I think if Americans knew what some of Rosa Parks's ideological commitments were at the time, they would have considered her an unrespectable radical. But she did teach Sunday school. She was Christian and she was old. She looked like your grandma. So it was sort of the appearances of it. But yeah, that combination and the cold and calculating thing could go quite far. It was
I mean,
again.
we can talk about the Freedom Summer.
Forget about the Freedom Summer. Even the conflict with Bull Connor, I believe, is where what was his name? The guy who went crazy in the end. Um,
Oh,
uh,
not Bevins. Yeah.
Bevins, who was sort of for unpleasant reasons, not very well known these days, he was a master tactician, and his tactic was to enlist the local black kids to go and protest because the adults were too scared. The kids really didn't know better, and the adults were going to get pissed off and join in if their kids got hurt. And that more or less worked exactly as he planned. And that was very cold and calculating.
Yes.
That and Martin Luther King was not comfortable with it, but he went along with it, and it worked. Um, but that's how far they were they were willing to go. But you know, on the flip side, you're absolutely correct. That there was a deep moral commitment that they had that pressed them forward and made it so they themselves are willing to go and get put their lives at risk every single day.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of these details that you really like is the Albany movement. Nobody knows about that these days. Um, where the movement goes to Albany, Georgia to try and integrate the city. And the police chief there, Laurie Pritchett, has basically read about how the movement works. And he's like, yeah, they are looking for me to respond to them with over-the-top violence. So we are going to arrest people in a very calm and dignified way. We are not going to assault people. We are not going to beat people on camera. We're not even going to arrest them for violating Jim Crow laws. We're going to arrest them for protesting without a license or causing a public nuisance. And we're going to make sure that we don't overcrowd the jails because the movement is always trying to overcrowd the jails. So we have to have a network of jails set up all over, the county. And it works, right? Pritchett is able to diffuse the movement to prevent any of the really nasty, violent confrontations from happening. But Pritchett is still a staunch defender of Jim Crow, right? That's what he's doing. And the movement knows it. They kind of hate him for it. And so what do? I mean, they leave Albany and they go to I want to say Birmingham. Is that where Bull
Yeah,
Connor is?
yeah,
Right? They
yeah,
pick Birmingham. They pick Bull Connor because he's brutal. Right? They pick
yeah.
him because he's a thug and it will generate the kinds of confrontations they want. And I think this gets to something we were dancing a little bit around the role of media, the role of narrative, but I think it's really important to understand here that the movement wasn't really a mass movement, right? The Freedom Rides are a few thousand people. Freedom Summer is a few thousand people. The Montgomery bus boycott is, I want to say, 17,000 people. Um, right? Montgomery is not a big town, right? So and the same is basically true of all the actions that they take, that this is not, we're going to have an uprising across the entire South in every city. We're going to pick a specific city and we're going to have a very focused protest. Maybe a few hundred people who are ready to show up and sit in at lunch counters. But they are able to, as we've talked about, like generate images, generate a narrative, drive a national media and political conversation by picking the right kinds of confrontations, even if they're not a mass movement, which I think is really important to think about in our own times, right? I think
Yeah.
there's this mythology almost about mass movements, that the way you create change is through a mass movement. And like, I mean, as I said at the beginning, like so much of my own I don't know, being off kilter about all these things is recognizing that we've had mass movements and they haven't worked, right? And so, and realizing, reading Ricks and realizing that on some level we've retconned the civil rights movement into being a mass movement because we think it had to have been a mass movement,
Yeah.
Mhm.
right? Well, if they
The
won,
March on Washington, right? We like focus on that one, right?
no, I think the March on Washington is very, very important here because it's only 250,000 people, right? Only 250,000. And it's a lot of people, let's be clear.
Yeah.
It is a lot, especially for back then. But yes.
Right. It's a lot of people. It's a lot of people for back then. But that's their moment of absolute maximum effort, right? Of we are going
Yeah.
to plan and prepare for this. We're going to bus in people from all across the country and we top out at 250,000.
And I'll also say maximum effort, minimum demands, right? It was really just a show of force, which you can do in pure numbers terms. But if you want a concrete change, you have to have more discipline than you can have with 200, some thousand people.
That's right. Yeah, so I mean, I think these days, like oftentimes you see people saying, well, we have 15 million people in the streets, and if we could just organize them, then obviously, and it's like you can't. I'm sorry, like I just don't see a possibility for, given
Yeah.
the constraints we're operating under.
15 million people isn't like you organize activism. That's like you create a dues paying caucus or something. Like that's
Hmm.
that's like you're trying to influence electoral politics, not like do direct action. You don't do direct action with 15 million people.
Yeah, and I think that's, I mean, people sometimes think this and they kind of despair and they think, well, how are we going to create change? But I think the civil rights movement really says you can create change with a small group of committed people who have a clear strategic understanding of what they're doing, who have a real moral foundation for what they're doing, and to be honest, who are willing to pay a very serious cost for what they're doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
In fact, that's the only thing that has ever changed the world.
As the
I'm
saying
sorry.
goes, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's important to learn both what they have that we still have and what they didn't have that we project onto them. It's not just that they were small, they were very local. MLK famously failed in Chicago. He was a very regional, he was a national figure in that he was known, but he was a very regional figure in terms of what he effectively accomplished. And true for most of these guys. And that's not a bad thing. That's not a criticism. The reason they could succeed, I mean, MLK started out because he was literally there, you know, at where was the bus boycott? At
Montgomery.
Montgomery.
Montgomery. He was there in Montgomery, in the church,
Yep.
and through the churches, he organized the local community, and that was what propelled him to leadership. So, it's not a criticism. That's why it worked there. Now, today, of course, we have a national problem, but, much more so with Trump and the federal government and things. So it can't be the same approach. That said, there are still people who are in positions of power in various blue states or blue localities who have at least some of the levers of power that they may hesitate to use. So tactics aimed at just forcing them to use them are still on the table. And what the movement showed is you don't need a mass movement. You just need the commitment, the vision, and good strategy. So that's not gone. That doesn't disappear. That hasn't disappeared.
No, I think that's exactly right, and that's something I think we want to talk about here at the end of our little hour, is what specifically these lessons have for us today. And one of them is just having a clear strategic understanding of our situation, right?
Yeah.
And one of the really important things to recognize is that we do not have the formal levers of federal power. We don't control Congress, we don't control the presidency, we don't control the court. And so I think a lot of people are kind of, I mean, you look at people on social media and they're yelling, why aren't Democrats stopping this? Why aren't they doing anything? It's like Democrats can do certain things, But we have to recognize we're going to take some losses at the federal level. That's coming. But we still control other formal levers of power, especially at the state level, especially at the city level, and that this can do a lot to resist what's happening at the federal level if we can generate the right kinds of confrontations, force Democratic officials to take the right kinds of stands, um, and also to advance the right kind of narrative, right? I think there's a kind of protest where, I mean, something I've gestured at with this soup thing, where like, well, you do something crazy and spectacular and disruptive, and everyone gets mad at you, and after they're mad at you, you explain, well, I did this for climate, and I think these are just like. People are just like looking at you and you're like, you are some punk who's wasting my time with these stunts. Right. The trick is to find the right kind of confrontation where the act itself is the message. Right. And it doesn't, what that is can vary quite a lot. Right. But the trick is to find them. Right. That's tactical, genius that you might call it,
Yeah, and like Adam said, it could be a matter of, throwing soup at the wall and seeing what sticks. No, I'm just kidding. But, he said there was a lot of, he used the example of George Floyd coming in at the end and Ferguson, after other situations hadn't quite galvanized things in that way, right? And he emphasized this aspect of not knowing, right? But I think both things are at play, right? If you're thinking strategically, if you're thinking carefully about shaping a narrative and that's a goal, you're going to narrow in on the right kinds of opportunities that might work, and then you can try a bunch of things within that space as opposed to, just doing all sorts of stuff, including lots of things that won't work. We are going to have limited resources. That's always true, of course. So,
Yeah, there was a article at the Unpopulous today, just sort of laying out starkly the situation we're in. And some of the comments on it are like, well, what am I supposed to do with this? You're essentially you're saying we're falling into a pit. What am I supposed to do to stop falling? Where's my parachute? And one guy said, I've protested, I've contacted my representatives, I've talked to people. Well, what should we do? Like, do I have to spend every minute of my life just trying to be an insurgency against our government now? And no, you shouldn't. That's impossible, right? Unfortunately, at some point, you just have to accept that we lost the election. They have the power, and there's limitations to what we individually can do on a given day, and we can't let it consume our entire lives.
well, I would say that some people will be inspired to have it consume their entire day, and some
Sure.
people will be
Oh, sure.
inspired to have it become the mission of their lives. And that's a big part of the civil rights movement story.
Yeah.
And
We need those people.
part of the job of people who can't have it be their whole lives is to stay out of those people's way and smooth the path for them. Another aspect he talks about in the book, or that is referenced in the book, is the importance of. Uh, I think it was very bluntly phrased at some point, not letting older people take over the movement. And that was extremely blunt, but it was saying, don't let our plans be subverted by people coming in and saying, no, 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 you're doing it all wrong, and let me take over and do it this other way, right? And there's a real danger there, and it will be generational. It will be old versus young, because what kind of person is going to be turned on, completely pissed, commit themselves fully to doing this? It will be young people mostly, and turn to politics. Like obviously the perfect metaphor is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez versus the Democratic establishment. And is the Democratic establishment easing the path of AOC to do what she can do? And what she can do, and they're not. They're like, oh, we know better, and they're blocking it, right? So here's something you can do as someone who's not going to fully commit your life to the project of taking this on, is don't mess it up when there are people who are doing that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that. I mean, we kind of touched on this a little bit with the tension between the NAACP and other parts of the movement. Is that it's always going to be a little bit fractious in this big tent, right? We're always going to have people working on different parts of strategy, working with just characterological differences. But I think it's important to recognize, like, yeah, we're all kind of on the same side here, right? And we have to have some tolerance for that. And I think that's an emotional commitment more than anything else. And one of these emotional commitments that Brooks talks about that I was very struck by was not just about whether you let this question consume your life, but whether you're expecting a quick victory. That it was the people who
Yeah,
thought they were going to win everything in 6 months. We're going to change the whole world. We're going to change the whole nation.
yeah,
The race question will be solved, and we're going to do it in a year. Those are the people who burned out.
yeah. That's just true in politics in general. Even in so like even in the Bush years, like Jason referenced the Iraq protests. I knew, I grew up in the DC area. I went to college in the DC area. There were a lot of very passionate people my age who just were completely destroyed by the results of the 2004 election, for example. They just like they put their entire heart and soul into activism, working the Kerry campaign, do whatever they were doing, and they lost. It was not a small loss, um, and they were just destroyed by it. They just the next day they were like walking around shell shocked. And I'm pretty sure they never did anything in politics again after that because they just couldn't handle it dispositionally. Um, and just that resilience of being able to understand that we have a huge sprawling system in a country of hundreds of million, um, many of whom are either willing to get on board with something, some quite evil things, or willing to engage in levels of self-deception to not believe that's what they're doing. Um, and it's just not there's never going to be a quick victory. Even Biden winning in 2020 was not a permanent victory, right?
Quite
So
obviously.
like the victories are not permanent, and the victories don't always come quickly. So you need people who are able to live with that, and not burn out when they don't win immediately, or when the wins they have are reversed in the short term.
I know it's a reality that many people think, oh, we can do this quickly, we can win quickly, we can win a permanent victory. But like, come on, think about human beings. Think about the human beings you know. Like, are people going to have huge change in their attitude in 6 months? Like, think of individual human beings in your life. Like, how many people undergo huge changes in 6 months that are permanent and they're like not racist anymore or something? And another issue, besides just the fact that we live in a society of grown ass people who are slow to change, there's also the reality that literally brand new human beings keep coming along.
They
You know,
just keep
new
coming. Yeah.
new generations, and guess what, they're not born woke necessarily. That people need to be educated and come up and have the right influences and all these things, and if they don't, they can end up unwoke.
Can't have that.
So the problem is eternal, because you can fix all the hearts and minds of everybody. Even if you could do it in 6 months, there will still be new people coming along. So yeah, the reality, there's cannot be a quick win.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about hearts and minds, that's very much been on my mind lately, not least because, I mean, when we talk about the strategic situation, Donald Trump won the popular vote. He didn't just win through some shenanigans through the Electoral College. He didn't win a majority of the popular vote, but he certainly won more votes than Kamala Harris. And I think that level of like public legitimacy, unfortunately, is going to matter. And so for us, one of the big questions has got to be how do we get it back? Right. I think there's people out there who kind of assume that we've already got it, that we have already got popular legitimacy, and it's only a matter of time before, Trump implodes on his own. And maybe that's true. I mean, we'll find out. But I think it's not something I'm comfortable taking for granted, right? If we want to get back to the kind of America we want to live in, we need to think about how do we convince our fellow Americans to change their minds, to support democracy instead of fascism, uh, to put it quite bluntly. That's the challenge ahead of us. And I hope this week here on Neoliberalism, we've talked a little bit about how people have approached that very same problem in the past and moved the boulder. So thanks again for listening. Thanks, Adam, for coming on. And thanks, Jason. Jason, this is your last episode as host, I believe.
Yeah, Samantha's going to be the one pushing this conversation forward, and really happy that that's going to happen, and it's going to be super. So good luck, Samantha, carrying on the neon torch,
Exactly, the
as it
neon
were.
torch. It's what is it? The flame is imprisoned lightning, and it will continue to be imprisoned and lightning here on Neon Liberalism next week. So thank you all for listening. Again, as a reminder, Neon Liberalism and our parent publication, Liberal Currents, are a listener-supported publication. So you can go on over to patreon.com/liberal currents if you want to support us and join our bustling Discord community and talk about any or all of these issues in even more of your free time. So thank you all and have a nice week.